welcome to the show. I had this brilliant thought the other day. I thought, symbols don't just wake up one morning and decide to become evil. People do that. And I've never really taken a really good look at that swastika because people take symbols, they rewrite the stories, they wrap them in power, and then they put them into history. Fewer images provoke a stronger reaction than the swastika. Yeah, try wearing one next time you go out to a party or something. Just slip it on your armband or something when you take off your jacket and watch the crowd. Across much of the world, it has become synonymous with Adolf Hitler, Nazi Germany, war, and genocide. But that's really not where the story began. For thousands of years, long before the Third Reich, the swastika appeared across India, Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Europe. It was actually carved into temples, painted on homes, woven into artwork, and used in religious traditions. It represented good fortune, harmony, prosperity, and the ordering of the universe. Nobody looked at it and thought, what about concentration camps? Nobody else looked at it and thought, well, Nazi Germany. So I'm going to go take a really strong look today as far as this item called the swastika. How on earth does an ancient symbol associated with peace become one of the most feared symbols on earth? Who first brought it into European political thought? Who connected it to race, nationalism, and identity? Who helped turn a sacred symbol into a political weapon? And why was Hitler able to adopt a symbol that had already been circulating through intellectual, nationalist, and elite circles for decades before he ever put it on an armband? Because somewhere between the temples of India and the rallies of Nazi Germany, the story changed. And when we follow that trail, we discover that the swastika did not simply appear in Hitler's hands. It passed through scholars, explorers, nationalists, empires, and powerful institutions before it became the emblem the world would come to fear. And we're going to follow that trail today. And also, because I've been talking about these people, I'll mention this before I get started. I'm going to be talking about people changing names. Yeah, changing names is kind of a thing with some areas. So I'll be covering this part first. And here's an example. Frederick Trump, or it was Trump back then, left Bavaria in 1885 at age 16 before completing mandatory military service. When he later tried to return and settle in Bavaria, officials rejected him, saying he had failed to deregister and had not fulfilled military duty. In 1905, Bavaria ordered him expelled and refused to restore his citizenship. So, the Trumps changed their name from Trump, it was the DR, what was it, DRUF, something like that, to Trump, right? After they left Bavaria, which they never really ever seem to want to acknowledge that side for some reason, right? They're much frequently quoted talking about the Scotland side. I knew someone who had actually changed his name years ago, and his name was a Jewish name. I'm not going to say it. I think he's hopefully still alive. And yeah, he changed it for professional reasons. And I didn't have any sketchy feelings at the time about it. He felt like he talked to me about it in great detail because it was quite a process. And yeah, I could certainly see his reasoning. It was something that I had never in my life considered until when I was writing my book. A close friend at the time suggested that I change my name to write my book. And, her concerns were, of course, safety and whatnot. Well, of course, well, I thought about it for a half a second, but then I, of course, brushed it aside. And was that such a smart move? Well, I don't really know because these people knowing who I am hasn't been really advantageous. But anyway, so I was thinking about for some reason name changes, right? Because a lot of when I'm going through researching things, things can get kind of confusing when you come to these new eras and these people have all changed their names and stuff. And then you got to remember the last name before you get to this name. But there's two specific groups of people who seem to change their names. Because I'm saying, it's not uncommon for regular people to change their name, but it is kind of, well, it's not that common, really. Okay. But the two groups are the royals and the religious people. Those people always change their names. And having done a lot of looking into those people, I can tell you it becomes kind of confusing. Well, when was he George the Fifth? Oh no, that was before. He was Fred the Second. So anyway, so name changes among royal families and religious institutions usually happen for a few reoccurring reasons: survival, legitimacy, public image, political adaptation, inheritance, and control of the narrative. With royal houses, the issue is often dynastic continuity and public acceptance. A ruling family may change the house name during war, revolution, marriage alliances, or national backlash. So, changing the name isn't always, it has a hiding kind of feeling to it, right? Just like they do this thing called flooding the zone, and what they'll do is they'll go in and flood the whole news feed with the same thing. Like I talked about this when I've been talking about MK7 in the past. If you look up all the people now using MK, it can become very confusing when you go to do some research, right? Because new names have been slipped in there. And so that's what you do from a PR strategy. If you want to get rid of some bad stuff about yourself, you flood the zone with other information. So it's really about as simple as that, right? You change your name and then you can flood the zone with a new name, and then people will eventually forget the old name or not connect the old name. But of course, these people would say, oh, no, no, we don't do it for those purposes. It's only for these good purposes. But yeah, personally, I think a lot of this is being done to kind of change the script around, right? So, but that, of course, is just my opinion. So a ruling family may change the house name during war, revolution, marriage, alliances, or national backlash, right? One famous example is the British royal family. During World War I, anti-German sentiment in Britain became intense because the royal family's original dynastic name was the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, sounding unmistakably German. In 1917, King George V changed it to the House of Windsor. The bloodline did not suddenly change, the public identity did. George V, the new name, sounded English, stable, and patriotic. Another example is the Prussian German royal line. We'll be talking about them today. The House of Hohenzollern, Hohenzollern dynasty. They often accumulated multiple names through marriages, territorial claims, and political mergers. In Europe, names were not merely surnames, they were claims to land, succession, and legitimacy. Religious institutions do something similar, but usually for doctrinal, political, or reputational reasons. Religious orders split, merge, reform, or rename themselves when leadership changes, scandals emerge, theology evolves, governments outlaw them, or they want to distance from older controversies. The Protestant Reformation alone created waves of renaming and splintering. Protestant Reformation was a movement begin as a reform. Excuse me, let me start over again. The Protestant Reformation alone created waves of renaming and splintering. It was a movement which might begin as a reform faction inside a church, then later became an entirely separate denomination with a new identity. Religious leaders themselves often commonly change their names. Popes adopt papal names upon election. Monastics take new names symbolizing spiritual rebirth or allegiance to saints or ideals. Pope Francis was born Jorge Mario Bergoglio. The name Francis intentionally invoked associations with humility and Francis of Assisi. And also, in his case, it was to ditch his direct association from what he had going on before he became the Pope, right? And kind of time for a cleanup, right? They didn't want him connecting to the old guy who was responsible for sending people to their death and just a few other little things like that. So, in both royalty and religion, names function as symbols of authority. And this is what it's key, right? Because they come up with all these names. Well, I am James the fifth of the blah, blah, blah. So, changing a name can erase unpopular associations, create continuity after crisis, signal reform, conceal foreign origins, unify factions, or emotionally reposition institutions in the public mind. There is also a practical historical reason. Before modern nation states and mass literacy, symbols, titles, coats of arms, and dynastic names carried enormous communication power. Many ordinary people never saw rulers in person. The name became part of governance itself. This is why the comparison between royal houses and religious institutions is not entirely superficial. Both depend heavily on symbolic continuity. If the symbol becomes toxic, they often modify the symbol before surrendering the institution behind it. And it stands out because most people spend their entire lives attached to one inherited identity, while royals and high ranking religious figures often step into what is essentially an institutional role larger than the individual person. That is unusual in the modern world, even though historically it was more common. For royalty, a name change is often tied to dynastic continuity, legitimacy, and symbolism. A king or queen is not just a person anymore. They become the living face of the state or dynasty. That is why regional names got developed. Pope Francis did not keep his birth name when he became the Pope. King Charles III chose to reign as Charles III rather than another possible regnal name. Queen Victoria was born Alexandria Victoria, but has ruled as Victoria. George VI was born Albert, but changed to George to project continuity during crisis years before World War II. Religious systems do something similar. The old identity symbolically dies off. The office or spiritual role becomes primary. The new name signals transformation, obedience, lineage, or mission. That is why monks, nuns, popes, and some mystics across cultures adopted new names long before modern brandy even existed. So, when powerful institutions rename people, modern audiences subconsciously notice the tension. Why does entering elite power structures require abandoning your original identity? That question is part of why people find it psychologically unsettling. Ordinary people generally do not do this outside of marriage, entertainment, or stage names, criminal aliases, immigration assimilation, or religious conversion. But historically, name changes were far more common among ruling, priestly, military, and these other classes. Many Jewish immigrants changed surnames when moving to the United States, Canada, Britain, Argentina, and elsewhere. Those reasons varied. To avoid anti Semitic discrimination, to make names easier to pronounce, to fit into mainstream society, for business and professional advancement. Examples often cited include names being shortened or anglicized or completely changed. Historians note that the old story that immigration officials at Ellis Island routinely change names is largely a myth. More often, families change names themselves after the arrival. For example, Goldstein might become Gold. Greenberg becomes Green. Cohen variants, including Conway, and other forms. Rosenberg can become Ross. Not every family changed names, of course. Millions kept their original name. After both World Wars, though, some German immigrants in the United States anglicized their names. German communities sometimes hid their German identity during periods of anti German sentiment. Families shortened or modified surnames to avoid prejudice. Schmidt became Smith. Müller became Miller. Schneider became Snyder. So, anyways, so yeah, also sometimes they rename streets and things. So, yeah, so lots of things change as far as names and stuff, but what you'll find is it's mainly with those two groups of people, right? So, German Americans were actually one of the largest immigration groups in the United States history. By the late 1800s, German language newspapers, schools, churches, and businesses were common across Midwest and elsewhere. During and after two world wars, however, anti German sentiment became severe. Do you think so? German language instruction was curtailed in many places. German newspapers closed. Communities stopped speaking German publicly. Some families anglicized their names. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage in some contexts. There were instances of mob violence and vigilante actions against people perceived as too pro German. So, Jewish history also in the Jewish communities, because they had medieval expulsions from parts of Europe, legal restrictions on residence, professions, and property, pogroms in parts of Russian Empire and during the 19th and 20th century, quotas and discrimination in universities and professors in various countries, and then, of course, a genocide of European Jews. So, yes, there was a lot of tension over names and stuff, right? So, why do the Germans and Jews stand out so much? Well, lots of very interesting reasons here. And I'll be getting to some very interesting details later as far as the records of all these people. A lot of the records of these early German immigrants just seem to have disappeared in some pretty significant fires. So now I'm just going to put the rest of it into context here. German immigrants were one of the largest immigrant populations in America, had highly visible cultural institutions, experienced a dramatic shift from acceptance to suspicion during wartime. The Jewish communities have a very long documented history of persecution across multiple countries and centuries. They experienced one of the most extensive documented genocides in modern history. That combination of large populations, extensive records, and major historical events makes their experiences particularly visible in historical narratives. I mean, I've talked about in the past, there were full on German villages in this country. I mean, complete nonstop German villages, okay? So, from the perspective of name changes specifically, both groups provide many examples of families altering surnames to navigate social pressures, discrimination, assimilation, or political upheaval. That is one reason Genealogists often encounter German and Jewish surnames changes when tracing family histories. And I think you might, well, you may or may not agree with me in a bit here, but there were a lot of fires that took place that would actually have hidden most of these family histories. So I'm not so sure what they were worried about because at one point it all went up in smoke, but I'll keep going. So, yeah. So many immigrants change their names to blend in, avoid discrimination, escape prejudice, right? So, anyhow, so let's go through a little bit of a timeline here. I have this major timeline that I'll have done soon that just kind of will blow the roof of your head off as far as how this stuff actually really transpired. The whole idea here is to identify what these people are up to and also who exactly are these people, right? So let's take a trip back to Spain before 1492. For centuries, the Iberian Peninsula was divided between Christian kingdoms in the north and Muslim states in the south. Christians, Muslims, and Jews all lived on the peninsula, though not always peacefully. And the Catholic Church had already been present in Spain for centuries at that point. 1469. Ferdinand II of Aragon marries Isabella I of Castile. The two largest Christian kingdoms in Spain become politically united. The couple later become known as the Catholic monarchs. 1478. The Spanish Inquisition is established. Although approved by the Pope, it is largely controlled by the Spanish monarchy. Very close from the very beginning now, aren't they? The Inquisition becomes both a religious institution and an instrument of state power. January the 2nd, 1492, Granada falls. The last Muslim kingdom in Spain is defeated. Bye bye, Muslims. For the first time, nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula is under Christian rule. The Spanish crown now possesses the military and political power to pursue greater religious and political uniformity throughout the kingdom. March the 31st, 1492, the Alhambra Decree is issued. Spain orders Jews to convert or get out of our country. Large Sephardic communities begin relocating to the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, Italy, Portugal, and the Netherlands. August 1492, thousands of Sephardic Jews depart Spain. August the 3rd, 1492, Christopher Columbus sails west. Off he goes to find America. What convenient timing, I have to say. October the 12th, 1492, Christopher Columbus reaches the Americas. Well, so what changed after 1492? Well, before 1492, Spain was religiously mixed. Christians, Muslims, and Jews all lived throughout the peninsula. Political authority was divided among competing kingdoms. But after 1492, the monarchy increasingly pursues one kingdom, one crown, one faith. Roman Catholicism becomes increasingly tied to Spanish national identity. So, why does 1492 matter? In a single year, Granada falls, Jews and gypsies are expelled, Columbus sails. Spain simultaneously begins religious consolidation at home and imperial expansion abroad. This becomes the launching point for many of the later stories in this timeline. The Sephardic Jewish migration into the Ottoman Empire, growth of Jewish communities in Istanbul, Samaria, Salonka, and Baghdad, Amsterdam as a refuge and commercial center. The Brownists migrate to Amsterdam and Leiden. We have the sabbatical Zivi movement, the rise of the East India Company, and the later emergence. So a lot gets launched off from this point. So let's start at 1499. The crown begins issuing major restrictions on Romani populations. Authorities order them to settle permanently, work under recognized masters, and abandon traditional itinerant lifestyles. This begins centuries of assimilation campaigns. 1500 to 1502, forced conversions begin for many Muslims in Spain. The crown increasingly pressures religious minorities to conform. And along in the 1500s, the Ottoman Empire absorbs large numbers of Sephardic Jewish migrants. If you're wondering, well, where's the Ashkenazi Jews? Don't worry, they're coming up later. Major Jewish centers develop in Constantinople, Istanbul, Smyrna, Izmir, Salonika, Aleppo, Cairo, and Baghdad. Jewish families, commercial, and religious networks expand across the Mediterranean. 1934, the Ottoman Empire captures Baghdad. Baghdad becomes part of the Ottoman imperial system. I've spoken greatly about them in the past, and here they enter the picture. The ancestors of the Sassoon family are believed to have already been part of Baghdad's Jewish community as of 1534. So in the late 1500s, Amsterdam emerges as a major commercial center. Religious refugees begin arriving from across Europe. Sephardic Jewish communities become increasingly visible there. Here's how it all happened. 1580 to the 1600s, the Brownists emerge in England. They're led by Robert Brown. They reject the authority of the Church of England. 1600, the East India Company is chartered. England begins building a global trade empire. 1602, the Dutch East India Company is formed. Amsterdam becomes one of the most important commercial and financial centers. 1608, the Brownists, they flee Europe, they flee England and settle in Amsterdam. This is where the whole story started for me. One day I was wondering, where do these people get started? Where is a point that I could start this whole deal at? And here is where I started in 1608. Because what I discovered was this: the Brownists, they fled England. They were called the Brownists back then, and they settled in Amsterdam, specifically in Leiden in 1609. In 1609 to 1614. Oh, so at that point, what I started wondering about years ago, I thought, okay, the Brownists, they end up in Leiden and the Amsterdam, right? So where they go from there? Well, some of them end up on the Mayflower. So my big question then became, well, wait a minute. Okay, so what happened to the rest of them? And that's where my whole research area opened up for me, because that is where I stumbled back onto Amsterdam, because yes, a lot of them stayed in the area and only some of them left. So that's what I'll be unfolding with this timeline right now. So we have the Brownists in 1609. They relocate to Leiden in Amsterdam, okay? And at the same time, 1609 to 1614, Spain expels large numbers. They're called the Moriscos at the time, which was the Gypsies. So hundreds of thousands leave Spain for North America, North Africa, and other regions. During the years of 1609, the Leiden congregation through 1620 developed there. Some remain permanently in the Netherlands. Others prepare for migration to America. And that was a key point there. A portion of the Leiden congregation board the Mayflower. They established Plymouth Colony. Many of the Brownists remain in Europe. Then around 1626, Sabati Zivi, I've talked about him. He was born in Smyrna. He grows up in an Ottoman port city connected to Mediterranean and European trade routes. 1650s, trade expands rapidly between London, Amsterdam, Venice, Constantinople, Smyrna, Aleppo, and India. Communication networks become increasingly sophisticated. 1665, Nathan of Gaza proclaims Zevi the Messiah. News spreads rapidly through Jewish communities in the Ottoman Empire, Amsterdam, Germany, Italy, Poland, Lithuania, and North Africa. The episode reveals extensive Jewish communication networks already operating across Europe and the Middle East. 1666, always a key year to pay attention to. The Zevi guy converts to Islam. His movement fractures. The event remains one of the most important episodes in Jewish history. So, what has happened in the late 1600s? Well, Jewish communities remain active through Baghdad, Smyrna, Saloniki, Constantinople, Cairo, Aleppo, and Amsterdam. 1700s, the East India Company evolves beyond trade. It increasingly exercises military and political power in India. India, home of that swastika, right? 1749 also, it's called the Great Gypsy Roundup. Spanish authorities conduct a mass operation against Romani communities. Families are separated, large numbers are detained. The effort ultimately fails and is gradually abandoned. 1757, the Battle of Plassey. The East India Company gains effective control over Bengal. 1765, the East India Company gains taxation authority. It now controls trade, revenue collection, administration, and military forces. 1792, David Sassoon is born in Baghdad. At this point, Baghdad has been in the Ottoman for over 250 years. Jewish communities have existed in Baghdad for centuries, and the East India Company dominates much of India. So then in 1832, David Sassoon leaves Baghdad for Bombay. This places him directly inside the commercial systems being built during East India Company expansion. You started to see where I picked up the hint here, right? Because I started thinking, oh, wait a minute. I was wondering about those Sassoons and how that swastika get taken around. The Sassoons were over there in India. And that's where I started picking up the trail in the Sassoons. So yeah, it just takes a lot of thinking and a really good timeline. So 1832, David Sassoon leaves Baghdad for Bombay. This places him directly inside the commercial system built during East India Company expansion. In 1833, though, the East India Company's China trade monopoly ends. Private merchant families gain opportunities. The Sassoons begin expanding rapidly. 1839 to 1842, drug up your neighbors, or the First Opium War. China is forced open to additional foreign trade. The Sassoon commercial network expands throughout Asia. 1858, the British Crown takes direct control of India. East India Company rule ends. The trade infrastructure remains, though. Late 1800s, the Sassoons become one of the world's most powerful merchant families. Now, isn't that interesting? A Jewish family from Baghdad, because of old David Sassoon leaving there when he did, ends up becoming the world's most powerful merchant families. Operations span Bombay, Shanghai, Hong Kong, and London. 1880s to 1914, modern communications accelerate globalization through railroads, steamships, telegraphs, and international banking. Jewish communities are documented throughout Russia, Germany, Austria Hungary, Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and the United States. 1914, World War I begins. At this point, the Ottoman Empire still exists. The Sassoons are internationally known, and Jewish populations throughout Europe and the Middle East are well documented. Networks visible during the Zevi period have evolved into modern institutions, newspapers, charities, businesses, and political organizations. So essentially, this is how it worked. 1492, Spain consolidates, expels the Jews and the Gypsies, and launches the Atlantic expansion. 1500s to 1666, Ottoman Jewish communities grow. Amsterdam becomes a refuge and trade hub. Zevi reveals the scope of Jewish communication networks. 1600s to 1858, the East India Company builds a trade and empire system linking Britain, India, the Middle East, and China. And of course, the Sassoons were running the East India Company. I don't think I mentioned that earlier, but so 1792 to 1914, the Sassoons rise from Baghdad to Bombay and beyond, operating inside a global system built on centuries of migration, trade, empire, and communications. 1914, many of the networks that began taking shape after 1492 are now part of a fully interconnected global world. 1916, of course, they broke up the Middle East. The secret Sykes-Picot Agreement is negotiated between Britain and France. It proposes dividing much of the Ottoman Middle East into spheres of influence after World War I. Many later borders roughly follow this framework. Spain expels the Sephardi Jews. Ottoman cities absorb them. Amsterdam becomes a refuge and trade hub. The East India Company connects Europe, the Middle East, India, and China. Families such as the Sassoons move from Baghdad to Bombay. The Ashkenazi Jewish populations grow in Eastern Europe. Millions migrate to America. And that's the Ashkenazi Jews I'm talking about. Chicago becomes a major destination for Ashkenazi Jews. Fires, wars, border changes, and lost censuses break parts of their paper trails. So, yes, there are a lot of very unfortunate things that happen. I don't know why I find this so funny, but it is. So, after after the Ashkenazis started migrating to America, fires broke out. Lots of records got lost, and the paper trail pretty much got lost. And of course, I'll be getting much more into all of that. So, because now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the trail of the Ashkenazis. Because remember, the other ones, Sephardic ones, they were hopping over there and going over the other way. But the Ashkenazis were heading over toward the Eastern European part. So that's where I got them separated out here. So yeah, because the history books keep talking about, oh, Sephardic Jews had to leave Spain and blah blah blah, and I kept thinking, well, yeah, okay, well that's just one group of them. What about the Ashkenazi Jews? Well, they came out of a whole different area. So this is where kind of trying to understand history can be a little confusing because they have specialist historians reporting on each specific part of this. So any dot you want to connect, you got to like literally connect pretty much on your own. So yeah, so anyway, so yeah, because the Ashkenazi Jews, they lived primarily in the German-speaking lands along the Rhine River. That's where they got the name from. They came from centers including cities such as Mainz, Worms, and Speyer. They later expanded into Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. They spoke Yiddish, a language with strong German roots. So then I went back and I took another look at, okay, so we got the Sephardic ones coming out of Spain in 1492, right? So then I took another look into, well, what was happening to the Ashkenazis around 1492. Well, they were dealing with their own expulsions and migrations. I'll tell you how that went. 1290, Jews were expelled from England. 1306, large scale expulsions from France. And this is just the Ashkenazis group. 1348 to 1351, during the Black Death, many Jewish communities in German lands were attacked after being falsely blamed for the plague. And yes, the Jews that were in that area during the time of the Black Death were, in fact, Ashkenazi Jews. Surprise, surprise. So, the 1400s, many Ashkenazi Jews moved eastward into Poland and Lithuania. So, that's where that move took place. So, Um, so by 19, no, excuse me, I keep flipping the numbers. So by 1492, the largest and fastest growing Ashkenazi communities were increasingly found in Poland, Lithuania, Bohemia, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire. So while the Sephardic center remained in Spain, so that's how they split out. Okay, so it's important to keep those straight. So and you'll notice at the end of all this, well, according to their own population records, it seems like not many Sephardic Jews left and more Ashkenazi Jews left. But hey, we'll have to figure that out later, right? So yeah, so there were a lot more Sephardic Jews in the beginning, but somehow they seem to have disappeared. But maybe that was what World War II was all about, right? Well, we're going to get rid of our relatives, those Sephardic Jews. So maybe during World War II, we'll lock those people up, steal their stuff. Yeah, that could have been how, that could have been the Jews that we're talking about that were killed during World War II, right? Because remember, by the time World War II hit, all this stuff had happened, right? So somebody knew where all these Jewish communities were, right? And a lot of Jewish communities fled into the area to interact with that Zivi guy. So by the time World War II hit, somebody knew where all these rich Jewish people lived, right? Somebody did, right? Not me, not you, but somebody did. Because my idea originally, and still kind of is that, well, of course they knew where all the money was because that's how these people operate, right? So just possibly leading up to the World War II and the confiscation of all that loot and stuff, maybe a lot of this identifying of these groups was partly to identify where's all the money, right? What relatives are where. Because then when it came time to loot everybody and fill up those trains and load them up to Habsburg territory up into Switzerland, they knew where to go get the money, right? So, yeah, I thought maybe that was all about information gathering, right? So let me get back onto these Ashkenazis. So, yeah, because the Sephardics moved into Ottoman, yeah, blah blah blah. Okay, so the Ashkenazi Jews continue expanding in Eastern Europe. By the 17 and 1800s, Poland, Lithuania, and neighboring regions contain the largest Jewish populations in the world, but that would mean Ashkenazi Jewish populations, right? So, around 1492, there were essentially two major Jewish geographic centers, and that's as far as I'm going to split this deal, okay? So, we had the Western Mediterranean world of Spain, Portugal, and North Africa, and the Ottoman ports. This was primarily the Sephardic groups. Then we have Central and Eastern Europe. There's German states, Poland, Lithuania, Bohemia, and Hungary. This was primarily the Ashkenazi groups. So when Spain expelled the Sephardic Jews, the Ashkenazis were mostly hundreds or even thousands of miles away in the German and East European world. The expulsion directly transformed the Sephardic world, while the Ashkenazi population was simultaneously growing in Central and Eastern Europe. By the late 1800s, the demographic center of world Jewry had shifted heavily toward the Ashkenazi communities in Eastern Europe, which is why so many Jewish immigrants arriving in places like New York City and Chicago between 1880 and 1924 were Ashkenazi rather than Sephardic. So, Got that part out of the way. So, yeah, start off in Spain with one section of groups getting kicked out, but suspiciously the same time Christopher Columbus set sail. Well, the timeline starts to show a different kind of picture now, doesn't it? So what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be taking a break, and then I found a couple of fabulous articles. One is about Adolf Hitler and his dealings with India, and also another one. So I will be back on the other side. Okay, this is a really great article I found from the Times of India. Adolf Hitler, the infamous Nazi dictator, had a complex and contradictory relationship with India and its people. On one hand, he admired the ancient Indian culture and appropriated the swastika symbol as a sign of Aryan supremacy. On the other hand, he despised the modern Indians as an inferior race and supported the British colonial rule over India. In this blog post, we will explore some of the aspects of Hitler's connection with India based on historical sources and evidence. One of the most prominent figures who tried to establish a link between Nazi Germany and India was Subhas Chandra Bose, a revolutionary leader of the Indian National Army, or INA, who sought Hitler's help in overthrowing the British Raj. Bose met Hitler in 1942 and requested him to delete some of his anti India passages from his autobiography, Mein Kampf, where Hitler had written that India was better off under British domination and that Indians could not even walk properly. Hitler refused to do so and showed little interest in Bose's plan of staging a revolt in India. However, he did help Bose escape to Japan, where he joined forces with the Japanese army against the Allies. Another aspect of Hitler's relationship with India was his fascination with ancient India and Hinduism, especially as propagated by Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and one of Hitler's closest associates. Himmler was obsessed with the idea of finding the origins of the Aryan race in India and believed that the Veda, the ancient Hindu scriptures, contained secrets of cosmic power and warfare. He collected books on Indian philosophy, religion, and history, and even sent an expedition to Tibet in 1938 to look for traces of Aryan ancestry. Himmler also tried to emulate some of the practices of Hindu ascetics, such as fasting, meditation, and vegetarianism. However, Hitler's admiration for ancient India did not translate into respect for contemporary Indians, whom he regarded as degenerate and unworthy of independence. He often praised the British for their imperial rule over India and considered it a model for his own plans of conquering Russia and Eastern Europe. He, meaning Hitler, also treated the Indian students and professionals living in Nazi Germany with contempt and suspicion, arresting many of them without charges or expelling them from the country. He also ignored the atrocities committed by his ally Japan against Indian civilians and prisoners of war. Thus, Hitler's connection with India was largely based on his distorted and selective interpretation of Indian culture and history, which served his ideological agenda of racial supremacy and global domination. He had no genuine sympathy or understanding for the Indian people or their struggle for freedom. His image as a friend of India, which persists among some sections of Indian society even today, is completely flawed and misleading. And then one more article about Germany. Nazis Germany's fascination with ancient India. The case of Heinrich Himmler. This is from, let me see, more than 65 years after the fall of the Third Reich. Nazi Germany remains an obsession with millions of people around the world. Adolf Hitler remains one of the most prominent historical figures from the 20th century, evoking both disgust and fascination. While other totalitarian regimes, including fascist Italy and Imperial Japan, have faded in the public fascination, Nazi Germany still exerts a powerful hold on many for a variety of reasons. Among the most interesting and perplexing aspects of the Nazi regime was its connection to India and Hinduism. Indeed, Hitler took the most prominent symbol of ancient India, the swastika, as his own. The link between Nazi Germany and ancient India, however, goes deeper than the swastika symbol. The Nazis venerated the notion of a pure, noble Aryan race who are believed to have invaded India thousands of years ago and established a society based on a rigid social structure or caste. While scholars in India and Europe have rejected the notion of an Aryan race, the myths and legends of ancient Vedic Hindu India have imparted a tremendous influence on Germany. Perhaps the most fervent Nazi adherent to India Hindu traditions was Heinrich Himmler, one of the most brutal members of the senior command. Himmler, responsible for the deaths of millions of Jews as architect of the Holocaust, was a highly complex and fascinating man. He was also obsessed with India and Hinduism. So there's an article, and they're going back and forth in the interview. The IB Times. Heinrich Himmler was reportedly fascinated by Hinduism and ancient Indian culture and had read the Bhagavad Gita, among other classic Indian texts. How and when was he introduced to Indian culture? Was it prior to his joining the Nazi Party or afterwards? Well, as early as 1925, when Himmler was only 24 years old and had joined the SS, and was just 2 years after Adolf Hitler's beer hall punch, Himmler wrote, "That is what we need. This is the salvation," referred to the military and ruling elite. So Himmler was deeply influenced by the Indiologist, yoga scholar, and SS Captain Hausen of the university in Germany, and the Italian philosopher Baron Evola. Himmler had a keen interest in the Rigveda and the Bhagavad Gita. That the Bhagavad Gita is at Bhagavad Gita. That's the same thing that other guy from the Oppenheimer quotes that. According to his personal massage therapist, Felix Kirstein, Himmler carried a copy of the Bhagavad Gita in his pocket from 1941 until his death 4 years later. The book was a translation by the German theosist Dr. Franz Hartmann. So yeah, so they go through what made him fascinated with it all, and I have the whole article down below. So aside from millions of Jews, Himmler was also responsible for the mass murder of up to 500,000 Roma gypsies. And the question was, did he not realize that the Romas are of Indian descent themselves? And the answer is this: Himmler even killed his own comrades, or SS officers. If, in his view, it served the supposedly higher cause, the ideology of the National Socialism. Himmler was not really sympathetic so much of the complexities of Indian culture, but rather to the idea of it and to the idea of purity. So, yeah, this is the whole thing. Himmler was not really sympathetic. Yes, they did not care. They really, it's kind of fascinating to a lot of people, but they just do not care who they kill. And people have a really hard time hurdling over that thing. So, anyway, so I have the rest of the interview down below. So, anyway, let's talk about I'm going to give you a little bit of update on these Sassoons. The Sassoons became known as the Rothschilds of the East. Their money and business networks helped shape the colonists' Bombay, Mumbai itself. Libraries, docks, schools, hospitals, mills, and commercial infrastructures still carry their name. And remember, the Sassoons were the ones who, once David went to India, and by the way, he never learned English and he never changed his custom robe. But when he went, David was the founding guy who went to India. And yeah, they really set up some very interesting things when they were in India. And that was where I started with this whole story because when I was looking into the swastika, I thought, well, if there's an origin point for this swastika, somehow this Sassoon guy has to be in the middle of it, right? But you'll have to come to that conclusion yourself in a bit here. So I'm going to keep going here. So how did the controversial part is that their rise was also tied to the India China opium trade during the British Empire. Yeah, so the Sassoons were also on the very ugly side of the street, right? This is one reason historians still debate their legacy. Builders and philanthropists on one side, participants in a system with enormous social damage on the other side. So, anyway, so in the 1800s, European scholars noticed similarities between Sanskrit and European languages. Some then sketched these observations into racial theories about an ancient Aryan people. German nationalists later seized on those ideas and adopted the swastika as what they imagined was an ancient Aryan emblem. People took things they noticed about languages, symbols, or history and turned them into ideas that certain groups of people were a special or superior race. For example, scholars originally noticed that many languages like Sanskrit, German, Latin, and Greek seemed related. That was the language observation. Later, some writers wrongly stretched that into, well, maybe the people who spoke those languages all come from one superior ancient race called Aryans. So the original idea was these languages may share common roots. But the later racial theory became these people were one special biological race. The first was mainly about language history. The second became a racial theory and later was used by nationalists and Nazi movements. The word Aryan, Aryan, is a word used long ago by some ancient people to describe themselves, meaning something closer to noble, honorable, or our people. In ancient India and Iran, forms of the word appeared in very old texts. It was originally converted to language and cultural identity, not a modern race category. In the 1800s, some European writers and racial theorists began using the term differently and wrongly turned it into the idea of an Aryan race. Later, the Nazis adopted and distorted that racial idea for their ideology. So, originally a cultural self description, later turned into a racial theory by later writers. The Sanskrit word Arya, was originally an ethno-cultural term designated for those who spoke Vedic Sanskrit and adhered to Vedic cultural norms, in contrast to an outsider or an Aryan, non-Aryan. By the time of the Buddha in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, it took the meaning of noble. In old Iranian languages, the term was likely used as a ethnocultural self-designation by ancient Iranian peoples. So yeah, so the word really took a really big shift, right? Because it originally was describing people as noble and stuff, and all of a sudden it became something that became pretty wicked, right? So, how did that all get started? Well, the 1800s, British India was a place where merchants, imperial officials, archaeologists, linguists, and elites from many backgrounds were colluding in the same world. Trade networks moved goods, while academic and political networks moved ideas. Those were parallel groups that were working at the same time in British India. So, in the 1700s to 1800s, European scholars noticed similarities between Sanskrit, Persian, Germanic languages, Greek, Latin, and others. Some people then made a leap from those languages are related to the speakers must come from one original people. And then it became that original people were a superior biological race. So by the late 18 and early 1900s, some writers in Europe, especially in German nationalist circles, started attaching northern Eastern traits such as a blonde hair, blue eyes, and whiteness to this imagined Aryan race. The Nazis later adopted and amplified the idea. The oddity that historians often point out is the earliest Aryan references come from regions around ancient India and Iran, yet later European racial theories often reimagined Aryan as a primarily Northern European. That was not a direct continuation of an ancient meaning, it was a reinterpretation layered on top centuries later. So basically it was a cultural linguistics idea to start with. And then in the 17 to 1800s, they began comparing the languages. Then late 1800s, the racial theories emerged. So by 1920 to 1940, the racial ideology of the Nazis adopts Aryan. And this is where the kickoff point is because what I've been trying to figure out is where exactly where between this 1800s and this 1920 thing did somebody cook the books on this Nazi thing? But before I get there, I'm going to tell you another little story. So just keep that in mind. What we're circling here, that's where it started off as a peaceful thing. Because when you hear it described like, yeah, that swastika was peaceful, and then all of a sudden it became evil in Germany. Well, I had to figure out, well, how exactly did that happen? Well, I'm going to take a break from all that because I want to introduce one of the characters in the middle of all this opium deal and the Sassoons and all that, and that would be Franklin D. Roosevelt. I've talked about FDR in the past and said that he came from the family that was part of all of that opium money. He didn't like to talk about the Delano part of his family. And I'm going to talk about it now just kind of because I love odd details and because I've never really explained his complete story. And it connects completely to this story today. So now is my chance to tell you all I know about Franklin D. Roosevelt. The Franklin D. Roosevelt family did connect through the Delano branch to America trading networks involved in the China trade during the 19th century, including opium related commerce. Warren Delano Jr. is the central figure usually discussed. He worked through American merchant houses operating in China, Hong Kong, Canton, and broader maritime trade networks tied to British imperial commerce. The Delanos were connected to firms participating in the same broader commercial systems that included British trading houses, shipping firms, insurance, banking, tea trade, silk trade, and opium distribution. Historically, American merchant families often operated alongside British imperial trade systems. Gee, I wonder why that is. The Delanos were not uniquely outsiders secretly doing something separate from the era's commercial systems. Rather, Opium commerce was deeply embedded in the global trade structure of the time, especially around British India, China treaty ports, shipping finance, merchant banking, and maritime insurance. The Sassoons, Jardine Matthews, and various American merchant families all operated inside overlapping China trade environments during the 1800s. As for Amsterdam, there are also broader historical layers there too. The Netherlands had long been one of Europe's major commercial and maritime powers. See, that's how it all worked out, right? Because when they left the UK, they ended up in the Netherlands. So that's how Netherlands also on the dark side is where all the porn and stuff is running through. So well, can't keep it good all the time, right? So the Netherlands had long been one of Europe's major commercial and and you always want to leave your people behind, right? And that's where I finally got onto this trail because you want to leave your people behind to watch the money, right? So that's why some of them stayed behind and some of them hopped on that Mayflower. So the Netherlands created the Dutch East India Company, global shipping, colonial trade, banking, insurance, port finance. Amsterdam remained an important financial center even after British overtook the Dutch maritime dominance. Many elite merchant families across Britain, the Netherlands, France, Germany, and the United States became interconnected through banking, shipping, trade partnerships, marriage alliances, and investment networks. FDR distanced himself from the opium aspect of the family history. Historians have noted that later generations of elite families often emphasized philanthropy, diplomacy, public service, banking, and politics, while minimizing or softening earlier fortunes tied to slavery, opium, colonial extraction, war contracting, and monopolistic trade. So yeah, same thing they're doing today. Everybody's scrambling to say, "No, I came from the working class," and then their audience finds out they came from extreme wealth. Yeah, the patterns repeat, right? It also repeats in some very tragic ways. So I'll be getting more into that later. So the Delano family did participate in China trade networks. Yeah, they all tie together. And there's two terms I want to distinguish here because I always kind of get them confused. If you're talking about Orthodox Jewish and Ashkenazi, they describe two different things because there's those Orthodox Jews over in Israel that read all those horrible books and stuff, and then we have the Ashkenazis, right? So, but Orthodox refers to the religious practice and belief. Ashkenazi refers to the historical ethnic origin and culture. So, an Orthodox Jew can be Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, Yemenite, Ethiopian. And so, yeah, so that's how you break that down. So that's why Ashkenazi Jews are historically associated with Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Germany, Poland, Russia, Austria, Hungary. And the language they traditionally speak was Yiddish. And the Sephardic Jews, historically associated with Spain, Portugal, and later Ottoman regions after expulsions. And their languages included Ladino and Spanish influenced dialects. And then the Mizrahi Jews, they were historically associated with the Middle East, Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Yemen. So the David Sassoon family, they came from the Baghdad, Iraq Jewish world, which is generally classified as Mizrahi or sometimes Sephardi Mizrah. So anyway, so that's where the Sassoons came from, okay? Because it's very easy to confuse them. In modern America and Europe, many visible Orthodox communities are also Ashkenazi. See, that's where it kind of gets confusing, right? Because Eastern European Jewish migrants were massive in the 1800s to 1900s, and many Orthodox institutions in the U.S. developed from those communities. So, yeah, If you trace back most institutions in the United States, they trace to the Ashkenazi, no matter what word you're splitting it up with, right? So, anyways, so because they had the Iraqi Orthodox Jews, Syrian Orthodox Jews, Persian Orthodox Jews, Yemenite Orthodox Jews. So, yeah. Anyhow, so that's that. Um, so that's how they started off over there. One name I'd like to put in the middle here, in case you go looking for yourself. There's another name you're going to hear when you talk about the Sassoons. A guy named Vidal Sassoon. Excuse me, and that's because I remember their name. They ran all these hair commercial ads in the 80s. Vidal Sassoon came from a completely different background. He was born in London in 1928, born from a poor Jewish family in East London. And anyway, so Sassoon, they had all these hair products, but Sassoon is an old Jewish surname with Middle Eastern roots. So the name itself comes from Sasan or Sassoon, meaning joy and happiness. Boy, that's interesting, isn't it? Because look at the joy they bring people. They rob people, they murder them. I guess if you think in an inverted sense, maybe. So that surname existed across multiple Jewish communities in Iraq, Syria, and yeah, it makes you kind of wonder why they are bombing some of these eastern places, right? So anyway, anyhow, so if you run across the Vidal Sassoon people, wrong group. They were the hair people, and they claim they're not connected. Okay, there's really they like these things in threes, right? There's this poster that I found and this thinking that I found, and it's called "The Controlling Families." House of Rothschild, uncrowned kings of Europe. House of Rockefeller, princes of North America. House of Sassoon, masters of India and China. East India Company trade was divided into many parts, and a particular family owned a particular part. So, how these houses all run together, I'm not really sure, but I put the picture of all of them down below for you to take a look at. So let's take a look at some of these dates here. Because this group of people, between the Sassoons, the Rockefellers, and the Rothschilds, they're really the key. If you look at the demographics of areas, okay, and the shipping and the money and stuff, they really do make a 3-point system, right? And they further broke it down to the House of Encapes, which is the Lord of the Seas, the House of Jardine and Matheson, which is the noble opium knights, and the House of Rhodes and Oppenheimers, which is African monopolists of gold and diamonds. So, yeah, I see those people as a controlling family. That makes sense to me. So, we're going to get closer to when these things first started changing. Because before the Civil War, um, we had all these things going on, right? And there's some really critical key points. I'm going to put this on hold for a second here. Okay, so we're going to start off the whole premise today, as I'm talking about, the Iron Cross and the swastika were both worn by Hitler, okay? I was not even connecting them a few years ago until I was looking at some pictures, which I love to do, and I noticed that everybody seems to wear those royal crosses, right? And then I also noticed that Hitler also wore the same Iron Cross that the royals wore. So somehow they're all kind of connected, right? Otherwise, why are they all wearing an Iron Cross? Well, during the Napoleon era in 1813, the Iron Cross is created in Prussia during the war against Napoleon. It was commissioned by King Frederick William III. It was designed by Karl Friedrich Schnickel. At this point, it was purely a Prussian military symbol. Later, German Empire adopts it. Military aristocrats start wearing it. World War I, Germany uses it. Nazis later revive and weaponize the image politically. So, so 1815, the Congress of Vienna recognizes Europe after Napoleon. Vienna becomes the diplomatic center of Europe, which is the old Habsburg territory, right? The aristocratic power hub, aristocratic center of the Habsburg Empire. So I got to put this. Oh, okay, so 1850. And then we had the Sassoon period started in 1792. So they kind of are running along the same thing. And what happened around the same time of all this stuff, right? The Congress of Vienna, right? They get themselves into power, become the center of psychiatry and all that, 1815. Well, conveniently, very conveniently, in 1814, right around the same time, they're over in Vienna starting to cook up ways to trick our minds and stuff. Just so happens that Washington, D.C. gets burned to the ground pretty much. So that date really started to connect in my brain because why would they have to burn down Washington, D.C. right at the time that Vienna is becoming the center, the diplomatic center of Europe? Why do they have to go and burn down Washington, D.C.? Well, that's a very good question, right? The burning of Washington occurs during the War of 1812. British forces burn the Capitol, the White House, government buildings, administrative records. This later contributes to historical gaps and lost documents from the earlier federal periods. People often point out how much early American documentation from the late 1700s to early 1800s was incomplete, destroyed, scattered, or poorly archived. That does not automatically mean deliberate coordination, but historians acknowledge that early American record preservation was far weaker than many people assume today. So, right at the same time they're over there in Vienna, we're over here in the War of 1812. Well, the War of 1812 period caused fires, chaos, administrative disruption, lost records, fragmented archives. So, because they were able to, when they burned Washington, they destroyed the government offices, all the military documents, the treasury records, congressional materials, and the administrative periods. This to me, I don't know, call me crazy, but this to me looks like a reset, right? um, this was not the main. This was not the main destruction of immigration records. No, it gets far worse. I have much worse for you, and it gets far worse when the Ashkenazi Jews enter Chicago. The amount of fires that start taking place, it just escalates just amazingly. Okay, the United States barely even had centralized immigration systems yet in 1814. Large-scale federal immigration tracking was still primitive. So they thought, well, let's just burn it all up, right? So I tracked one of these fires, and I'll tell you why I'm tracking it again, because I found out the people that were actually, the records that were actually burned up in these fires, and that part was fascinating. So the really big immigration records problem, I would say it started on Ellis Island around 1897. This is the one most people are referring to. June the 15th, 1897, a massive fire at Ellis Island, where all the migrants were coming into this country. The massive fire at Ellis Island destroyed passenger arrival records, immigration processing files, ship manifests, administrative documents. An estimated 17 million immigration records were lost. Those cover immigrants arriving roughly from 1855 to 1897. And hold those dates in your head, 1855 to 1897. So, why does this matter historically? Well, I got a million answers for you on that one. Well, massive European migration, the big industrial expansion, destroying thousands of records exactly during this era. The Gilded Age wealth growth, railroad labor information, political machine growth, ethnic neighborhoods were forming, banks were expanding, organized crimes were emerging, and labor struggles. So, yes, historians, genealogists, and research have long viewed the loss as extremely significant. So, then what happened to those records? Well, the 1890 census destruction. This is another massive hole in American historical records. So they burned Washington, remember back in 1814, seemed like years ago, right? So then in 1890, there was a consensus destruction. The 1890 United States Census destruction happened after a 1896 fire, and then they later had water damage and eventually the disposal of those records. So yeah, those poor records, I traced them a long time ago, but what I missed was specifically who those people were, and I'll get to that in a minute here. So much of the 1890 census was lost. Boom, gone. Okay, right? That mattered enormously because the 1890 census sat right between the Civil War reconstruction, industrialization, and huge immigration waves. For millions of Americans, that census would have been the key bridge between 1880 records and 1900 records. So, there were some records, I'm just trying to give you a complete looking. There were some records called the Castle Garden records. Before Ellis Island, immigrants often came through a place called Garden. Some records survived, some were fragmented, some were inconsistent. So uh, yeah, a lot of records seem to have gotten destroyed around the Civil War, and that's the whole era that I'm arguing that these people really took over full force. Now, I think they were planning to take over up until this point. That was the purpose of the meeting about our minds and stuff. But so they would, of course, be over there meeting about our minds, how to mess with us mentally and stuff. At the same time, destroying all the records, right? The destruction of the 1890 United States Census destruction affected almost everyone living in the United States at the time, but some immigrant groups were hit harder than others because of when they arrived and how dependent they were on the census gap. So, most of the 1890 census was destroyed, leaving a major hole between the 1880 census and the 1900 census. That creates a 20-year visibility gap for millions of people. So then comes the question that was on my mind the most. Well, which immigrant groups were affected the most? Ha ha ha, bet you'll never guess. Italians. Italians, from over there in Rome, Italy. Italians were very heavily affected. Isn't that just interesting, right? Mass Italian immigration exploded, especially around 1880, 1890, and early 1900s. So I guess when they were bringing over the mafia, they had to get rid of the records, right? So many Italians arrived after the 1880 census, but before the 1900 census. So who are they? Where are they? Hey, who knows, right? Meaning the missing 1890 census would have captured their earliest years in America. Gee, imagine that, huh? This especially affected Southern Italians, Sicilians, and urban immigrant neighborhoods. Today, many Italian American genealogists struggle with this exact gap. So, who else was affected? Boy, you'll never guess. Eastern European Jews. I couldn't make this stuff up if I spent the next 100 years. Talk about destroying your own evidence, right? Large Jewish migration from Russia, Poland, Lithuania, Austro-Hungarian territories accelerated after the pogroms, the political unrest, and the economic hardships, especially during 1880s to the 1910s. Many arrived directly into the missing census window. Was that convenient or not? I swear, these people excel at coincidences, right? Either this is all the biggest coincidence or the biggest crime scene I've ever talked about, right? Excuse me. Talk about torching your past, right? So, 1880s to 1910s, many arrived directly into the missing census window, and that affects Ashkenazi Jewish genealogy, name changes, family tracking, and origin tracking, especially because many names were later Americanized. You can't call them not smart, right? They were very smart during that time. They were very, very smart. So, okay, so the Irish were the third least affected. The Irish were affected too, but many major Irish immigrants waves occurred, especially after the Great Famine in the 1840s. So a large percentage already appeared in 1850, 1860, 1870, and 1880. But anyways, yeah, because they started coming in later, right? And the Germans, this is interesting. The Germans were less severely affected overall. German immigration peaked heavily earlier in the 19th century. Many German immigrants were already documented before 1890. Still, important losses occurred, but the genealogical damage is often less severe than for other later immigrant groups. Another group, the Eastern European and the Slavs, they were heavily affected. The Poles, the Ukrainians. If you haven't watched my other, or listened to my other shows, you'll think she's lost her mind. But Eastern European, just about every running things today I've been able to find. Even Melania Trump is from Eastern European. The Google people are from Eastern European. Yeah, everybody's coming out of Eastern European. So, so Eastern European and the Slavs were heavily affected. The Poles, Ukrainians, Slavics, Croatians, Ruthenians, Lithuanians, because many came during industrial labor expansion and mining booms and railroad expansions, and many arrived squarely inside the 1880 to 1900 gap. Very, very convenient. And then the Chinese immigrants. Chinese immigrants faced exclusion laws, discrimination, fragmented documentation, especially after the Chinese Exclusion Act. Their records were already complicated and incomplete before the census loss. Um, so yeah, so going down our list here, which group was worst hit? From a genealogical standpoint, probably the Italians and the Eastern European Jews, because their migration exploded precisely during the missing years. Well, isn't that convenient? Just so convenient. Many families first arrived in the 1880s. Urban overcrowding complicated local records. Names changed frequently. Naturalization paperwork was inconsistent. The missing 1890 census would have been the first major federal snapshot of these families in America. And what a shame we could miss it all, right? Oh, we don't know where the mafia came from. We lost the records. Don't blame us. So, yeah, that is really something else, right? Because here's the thing, the large scale Ashkenazi Jewish migration into Chicago happened in several waves, but the biggest period was roughly 1880 to 1924. That was the massive Eastern European Jewish immigration era into the United States overall. Most came from Russian Empire, Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarus, Austro-Hungarian territories. And of course, they were fleeing those pogroms, the military conscriptions, political instability, and anti-Semitic restrictions. Poor people, they had to go somewhere now, didn't they? Earlier Jewish presence in Chicago. So, 1840s to 1860s, these people we seem to know a little bit about. Earlier Jewish immigrants arrived first, especially German Jews, Central European Jews. Those earlier arrivals were often more economically stable. more assimilated into German culture, merchants and shopkeepers. They established synagogues, businesses, and charitable institutions. But this earlier group was much smaller. And then there was a huge Eastern European wave. 1881 becomes a major turning point. After the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in Russia, pogroms intensified. Restrictions on Jews increased. This triggered enormous migration from the 1880s through the early 1900s. Chicago's Jewish populations exploded. Chicago was becoming a national hub, meatpacking center, industrial city, manufacturing powerhouse. It needed labor and commerce, and the Jewish immigrants entered tailoring, garment work, small businesses, peddling, manufacturing, and retail. Major Ashkenazi immigration areas, including the Maxwell Street area. This became one of the most famous immigrant Jewish districts in America, known for crowded markets, Yiddish culture, street commerce, labor activism. Lawndale later became a major Jewish residential area. Population growth. Approximate Jewish population in Chicago in the 1840s, very small. 1870s, there were about 10,000 Jews in Chicago. 1890s, roughly 50,000. 1920s, over 250,000. So that is explosive growth in only a few decades. The 1890 United States Census destruction erased most federal data for that critical transition period. I'm sorry, I can't stop laughing. What a murder plot, right? Immigrant records from the 1880s to 1890s were already inconsistent. Many immigrants had already changed their names. Yiddish spellings were varied. Addresses changed constantly. Overcrowded neighborhoods created undercounting problems. So historians often reconstruct estimates indirectly. So, and before there was a big fire, excuse me, there was a big fire in Chicago. If all this stuff wasn't bad enough, if burning all the records wasn't bad enough, Chicago had its own way of dealing with things. Um, so anyway, so even before destruction, uh, there were language barriers, mistrust of government, transient populations, crowded tenements, undocumented borders, spelling confusion. Uh, this especially affected poor immigrants, urban laborers, and recent arrivals. Okay. Chicago was extremely chaotic. Late 19th century Chicago was exploding in population. Railroads, meat planting, garment industry, factories, slums, rapid housing turnover. Neighborhoods like Maxwell Street near West Side were crowded and constantly shifting. People moved frequently, boarded with relatives, used nicknames, Americanized their names later, sometimes avoided officials entirely. So, how many might be missing? Well, no exact number exists, but historians generally believe tens of thousands of individuals connected to late 19th century Chicago immigration history became difficult or impossible to track cleanly because of the missing 1890 census, the Ellis Island fire losses, and local records inconsistency. For the Jewish, Chicago specifically, the biggest visibility gap was the 1880 to 1900s explosion period. That is exactly when Eastern European Ashkenazi migration accelerated. Neighborhoods formed, businesses started, families Americanized, labor networks developed. So yeah, so they the population estimates were 50,000 by 1890 and 250,000 by 1920. So And that was often reconstructed using synagogue memberships, city directories, Yiddish newspapers, charity records, burial societies, school enrollment, neighborhood studies, and later census backtracking, meaning historians had to rebuild the picture indirectly because the direct federal snapshot was mostly gone. The lost 1890 census sat at the exact pivot point between older Jewish German immigration and massive Eastern European Ashkenazi migration. Without it, researchers lose a critical before and after snapshot of assimilation, neighborhood formation, occupational shifts, chain migration patterns, early labor organizations, family structures. That is why the 1890 census destruction is considered one of the worst archival losses in American demographic history. So, I need to take a break, but I think before I take a break, let me finish up on this thought. What came next to Chicago? Well, the Great Chicago Fire, October 8 to 10, 1871. I guess that would destroy what was there up until the fire, right? The fire destroyed enormous sections of Chicago, including homes, churches, newspapers, businesses, courthouses, municipal offices, and personal archives, and many earlier records disappeared with it. So, what was lost? Well, large amounts of property records, court records, church records, tax documents, city administrative papers, business files were destroyed. Some county records survived because certain buildings escaped destruction, but many did not. So, why this matters for immigration history? Now you got to combine the 1871 Chicago fire with the destroyed 1890 census with the 1897 Ellis Island fire. So, right in a row there, 1871 Chicago fire, 1890 the census fire, and then 1897 Ellis Island fire. Lots of fires going on. That creates huge blind spots for immigration origins, early neighborhoods, property ownership, chain migration patterns, and family structures, especially in rapidly growing immigrant communities. so, so let's go over a little timeline of record losses. 1871, Great Chicago Fire destroys large amounts of local Chicago documentation. 1890, census were destroyed. Most federal census records were lost. 1897, the Ellis Island fire, millions of immigration processes records were destroyed. So why Chicago is especially difficult? Chicago was growing explosively, heavily immigrant, industrialized rapidly. Many people rented informally, moved frequently, worked unstable jobs, changed their names, spoke little English. So even surviving records were often messy. Then fires and archival losses removed large portions of the paper trail. So they claim this 19th century America lost records constantly because cities were built heavily from wood. Fires were common. Archives were primitive. Humidity and water damage ruined paper. Governments lacked modern preservation systems. Cities like Chicago, New York, Boston, San Francisco all suffered repeated archival destruction events. What historians do instead, researchers have to reconstruct missing history using synagogue records, cemetery records, Yiddish newspapers, insurance maps, city directories, naturalization petitions, shipping manifests, school enrollment, labor union documents, charity organizational records. That is why modern immigration history often looks like detective work rather than a clean paper trail. So yes, there's a lot to all of this stuff, right? You got those Chicago fires going. First was the Chicago fire, then you had the big explosion in manufacturing, then you had the high waves of arrivals of the Italians, Eastern Europeans, the Russians, and all those people. Then the second major hit was the 1890. The census was completely destroyed. So, and the third hit would have been the 1897 Ellis Island hit. So, yeah. So, why does Chicago get mentioned so often? Well, Chicago was one of the fastest growing cities on the entire earth at the time. It was the largest immigration hub. It was the largest industrial labor magnet during exactly the period where records were burned, archives were vanished, and names were changed, and overcrowding complicated tracking. So, from a research standpoint, Chicago got hit on the early side, the middle side of the immigration era. So, yeah, so um, 1871 Chicago fire destroys early local records. 1880 to 1920 mass immigration boom. 1890 census records get destroyed. Critical national demographic snapshot gets lost. 1897 Ellis Island fire. Millions of immigrant records are destroyed. That sequence is why historians often describe late 19th century urban immigration reconstruction as piecing together a shattered puzzle. And also, we can't forget about Louisiana. Louisiana was just kind of innocently sitting over there as a port, right? Well, kind of a funny thing going on over in Louisiana. Louisiana, New Orleans was important because during the 1800s, New Orleans was one of America's largest ports, gateway to the Mississippi River system, a major trade center, a slave trade center earlier on, a Caribbean commercial hub, entry port to the interior United States. Immigrants entered through Gulf shipping routes, Caribbean routes, Latin American routes, French and Spanish colonial networks, not just through New York and Ellis Island. But over there, record keeping was often messy. Compared to later federal immigration systems, early New Orleans documentation could be inconsistent, decentralized, damaged, incomplete, multilingual. Records existed, but standards varied. Spellings changed. Manifests were inconsistent. Local archives suffered losses over time. And Louisiana had additional complications because of the French influence, Spanish colonial history, mixed legal systems, shifting governments, hurricanes, floods, fires, humid climate damaging paper, and of course, there was a Mississippi River system. New Orleans also functioned differently than Ellis Island. Many immigrants arrived quietly, dispersed rapidly upriver, moved into river commerce, entered agricultural zones, disappeared into frontier settlements. So tracing them later became harder. So, which groups came through Louisiana? Various groups arrived through Gulf ports, including French, Spanish, Sicilians, Germans, Irish, Caribbeans, Jews from Mediterranean regions, some Eastern Europeans later. Sicilian migration into Louisiana, for example, became extremely important in the late 19th century. I talked before there was some sort of a Sicilian lynching that went on in Louisiana during that time frame. So, different why historians get frustrated. People today often imagine neat, centralized databases, complete federal oversight, perfectly preserved manifests. But 19th century America was far messier. Different ports had different systems, different survival rates, different archival quality. And many records were local, church based, shipping company based, handwritten, or partially destroyed. And then some of these things, and I'll tell you this one story because it relates to, I think some of these things were made up, right? There's a great fire. There's a great story about the fire in Chicago. The woman blamed was called Catherine O'Leary, was an Irish immigrant whose barn was where the fire was believed to have started. The official investigation never proved that she or the cow caused the fire. They claimed that the cow kicked over the lantern. Historians now generally view her as a scapegoat, shaped by an anti Irish and anti Catholic prejudice common at the time. What is interesting historically is how powerful the myth became even after the confession. The cow and the lantern version stayed in textbooks, movies, songs, cartoons, and public memory for over a century. Chicago's city council eventually formally cleared Mrs. O'Leary and the cow in 1997. The exact cause of the fire is still not definitely known. Other theories include a an accidental ignition by people in or near the barn, a neighborhood party gathering, pipe smoking near hay, or broader drought and fire conditions across the Midwest that week. One thing historians largely agree on is that Chicago itself was extremely vulnerable to catastrophe at that moment. Yeah. Well, they claim were having long droughts and all that, wooden sidewalks and buildings, exhausted fire crews, rapid population growth, and weak fire infrastructure. But yeah, I think there was probably other reasons for it. But what happened was, I don't know where I have the rest of the story. Let me see. Um, what happened was, years later, a journalist confessed that he made up that whole story. So my theory is these things are really probably created by one of them, right? Or they seem to create a lot of fires. Or they say, well, it's because of the wooden buildings at the time. Well, what do we have right now in this country? We're set up like a tinderbox right now. So if they saw the error of their ways in these fires, they think, well, maybe we should start not building buildings with all these wood moving forward, right? Well, that's why this country is a complete experiment. It is meant to be built down in a ring of fire at some point here in the very near future. So I am going to be taking a break here and I will be returning later. So that gets us up until Chicago, right? And lots of records going missing. And all this thing will be able to be pulled into the complete picture later. But it does seem pretty suspicious to me that Washington happened to get burned down about the same time they're over in Austria trying to figure out how to how to work with our minds, right? So anyway, so I will be taking a break, be back on the other side. Okay, I am back. I've been recording this over different days, so if I sound different, that's the reason. In a previous segment, I was mentioning how they kill their own. Well, yeah, of course they do. I've even read that LBJ killed his own sister, and I really kind of believe the reports that came out about that. So I'm not like verifying it and, just saying that it's really true, but I believe that it's likely true. They go through MK7 as children themselves. So if the person at the top, if they're on the screen, they're likely on the team, okay? And if they come from these elite families, they in fact have gone through all this mind-splitting MK7 business as children themselves. So their minds at this point are pretty well frosted. So I'll get back with more about that about my show with the DOD. And because remember, the Titanic, I mean, how long did they plot to kill their other people on the Titanic? I mean, they went to the effort to build a whole new boat to get rid of some of their own. And now I read yesterday that a Nobel Peace Prize winning psychiatrist, I I almost feel like some days I could just get on the floor and start laughing and just never stop. And we've come full circle from Vienna to now. A Nobel Peace Prize winning psychiatrist declared that Trump is mentally unfit and must be removed from office. Let the circus resume. So, anyway, so what usually happens is history is full of examples where dynasties, royal houses, political leaders, and business families put power ahead of family loyalty. And, the histories are there with all these people, the Medici families, the Borgias, the Habsburgs, the Romanovs. And, many contain internal rivalries, disinheritances, betrayals, and power struggles. And I'll get back to more of that because I think it to a large degree, and I don't mean this uncharitably, but there's something wrong upstairs with a lot of these people, okay? And let me get back to with the Sassoon specifically, what is documented when I was looking into this because I talked about the Sassoons in the past, but certainly not to this level. I dug through everything because my first instinct was this. I thought, well, if somebody changed the meaning of the swastika along the way, who did it and when did it happen, right? Well, my first thing I thought, well, likely the Sassoons would have done it because they're all over the place, right? And then I thought, well, the UK would have also been part of if there was some sort of cover up of when this transpired. But really, it all boiled down to the timeline is how it happens because the Sassoons specifically, they were extremely ambitious merchants, I would have to say, who operated in highly competitive environments involving trade, finance, empire, and of course, opium. They were not passive figures. They built a global commercial network spanning Baghdad, Bombay, Shanghai, Hong Kong, and London. That alone requires some pretty aggressive business practices, if you ask me, and political navigation. So I would say that the Sassoons were highly well placed, okay? So one thing that these researchers always discover is that once families become wealthy and influential enough, the history record starts looking very different. Public biographies start to emphasize philanthropy, civic projects, and achievements. So, for the Sassoons, the strongest documented criticism center on their role in the opium trade. I would have to say that's a pretty big one, and you'll find out. I'm going to be talking more about that here in a second. And their integration into British imperial commerce and their accumulation of wealth through systems tied to colonial power. I mean, they really, well, they were running the whole deal, okay? So those are well documented questions. So then the question became in my mind, well, the Sassoons or the UK, who did it or who flipped that swastika? And I sorted through it all to the point that I was getting kind of dizzy. But remember, he who controls the history, right, also controls the rest of it. So I kept thinking, then I thought, well, I'm not going to probably find a smoking gun. Like nobody's going to say, well, at this point in history, they decided that the swastika had to be flipped to something evil. So I thought, well, give up that idea. No one's probably going to have any point in history. And this is why I love timelines. Can't say it enough. So, anyway, yeah, so I kept sorting through all those periods, and this appears to be the key period when the swastika moved from a symbol associated with peace and good fortune to one associated with some of the worst events of the 20th century. Perhaps it was another historical reset. Satanism is often described as inversion, and the swastika certainly experienced a dramatic inversion of meaning. The Sassoons, they ran schools, libraries, and numerous institutions. I could not find a smoking gun there, but they would have existed within networks that influenced scholars, educators, and historians. So, which institutions, donors, libraries, merchants, publishers, and networks helped ideas move from one stage to the other? Over on my website, I've got a lot more information, and I've got also some pictures that somebody put together showing the swastika from different points in history. So, that swastika did not begin as a Nazi symbol. For thousands of years, it appeared across multiple civilizations and carried meanings associated with good fortune, prosperity, harmony, spiritual order, continuity. The symbol existed long before modern nationalism, racial theory, or even Adolf Hitler. And that's another connection, right? Remember, Adolf Hitler spent time over in Vienna in the same region, right? I'm sure there's just no coincidence there. But swastika like designs appear in prehistoric archaeology. And, well, you're going to have to see if you believe those old archaeology things or not yourself, but they show up in Hindu traditions, Buddhist traditions, Jain traditions, and the Sanskrit word swastika is commonly translated as well being, good fortune, auspicious. And the symbol often appeared in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, Slavic regions, Germanic regions, early Christian decorative art, Central Asia, and Tibet. So the swastika was therefore not unique in any single civilization from what historians have talked about. But beginning in the late 18th century, European scholars became increasingly fascinated with India. Sir William Jones found the Asiatic Society in Calcutta in 1784 and helped introduce Sanskrit literature to European scholarship. So that's kind of a key point there. So then researchers noticed striking similarities among Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Germanic languages, and other Indo European languages. This produced the concept of an Indo European language family. During this phase, Aryan, Aryan, was generally used as a linguistic concept rather than a racial one. Among the most influential scholars was Frederick Max Muller, who repeatedly argued that Aryan referred to language rather than race. Later political movements would reinterpret his work in ways he himself rejected. And here's something about Germany. Germany's interest in India. The German interest in India was unusual in one sense. Germany had much less direct colonial control in India than Britain, yet German scholars became some of Europe's most influential Sanskrit and India specialists. Now, isn't that interesting? So, in the 1800s, many Europeans became fascinated with the idea of discovering an ancient origin story for themselves. Scholars were uncovering relations between Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Germanic languages, and other Indo European languages. Some began imaging an ancient ancestral civilization behind all of them. Then nationalism entered the picture. Germany was not unified until 1871. Unlike England or France, Germany was still constructing a common national identity. National movements often seek ancient symbols, myths, and heroic stories or origin narratives. The swastika fits several requirements simultaneously. The swastika is visually striking, simple to reproduce, ancient in appearance, connected to perceived Indo European origins, associated with strength, movement, destiny, or the sun, present in both Indian traditions and European archaeology. The process was probably less, well, let's find a peaceful symbol and make it evil, and more like, let's find a powerful ancient symbol that supports our story about who we are. So, yes, David Sassoon was born in 1792. These dates start to become so overlapping and belong to a prominent Jewish merchant family connected to trade and administration in Baghdad. Political instability under Daud Pasha contributed to David Sassoon's leaving Baghdad and eventually settling in Bombay in 1832. This move proved historically significant. Bombay was emerging as one of the most important commercial centers in the British Empire, connecting India, China, the Persian Gulf, East Africa, and Europe. Through trade, shipping, cotton, textiles, and opium, the Sassoons built a vast commercial network. The Sassoons, though, were not merely just traders. They funded schools, libraries, hospitals, synagogues, scholarships, civic institutions. Among the most famous institutions was the David Sassoon Library in Bombay. The family also supported broad educational projects beyond specifically Jewish institutions. Their influence extended into Bombay, Shanghai, Hong Kong, London, and other British imperial centers. These institutions became part of larger systems of education and information throughout the whole of British Empire. So yeah, that's why I was obviously suspect of the Sassoons, right? Well, the swastika existed in India during the period when the Sassoons operated there. And the Sassoons also funded education and cultural institutions. And these institutions preserve and circulate knowledge. So that was my thinking for quite a while. But I could not find any direct evidence demonstrating that Sassoon actually funded institutions and served as a special way to channel through which swastika symbolism or Aryan theories moved into German nationalist movements. So, yeah, I couldn't find a specific smoking gun, but my smoking gun is its timeline, right? So, yeah, so these ideas during the time they were circulating through universities, scholarly societies, colonial administrations, publishers, museums, private collections, missionary organizations, and merchant philanthropy. So the Sassoons participated in this broader environment, yeah, but there was no specific thing, oh, the Sassoons got involved with the swastika. But here is the smoking gun. Archaeology and the swastika. A major turning point occurred during the 19th century. In the 1870s, Heinrich Schleimer excavated Troy and reported numerous swastika-like symbols among ancient artifacts. This discovery changed the discussion. Previously, many European associated the symbol primarily with India. After Schliemann, scholars increasingly viewed the swastika as evidence of a broader ancient cultural world extended across multiple regions. The symbol was then no longer merely an Indian symbol. It became associated with theories about ancient Indo-European peoples. And the crucial transformation occurred between approximately 1890 and 1915. I would say a very curious time, right? Right at the same time that fires happened to be happening in Chicago, immigration was going like crazy, records were getting lost. So, yeah, the crucial transformation, because that's why I like to get to the root of things, right? Best I could find, approximately 1890 1915. Originally, scholars asked this question: what does this symbol mean? Nationalist writers increasingly asked, well, what does this symbol belong to? That shift fundamentally altered the conversation. Writers and activists began combining archaeologically comparative linguists, folklore, mysticism, nationalism, and racial theory. A couple figures became influential in promoting interpretations that linked the swastika to imagined ancestral German origins. But the symbol itself did not change, the interpretation changed at that point. And exactly who was around during that time? We'll have to really think about this one. The transformation of the swastika into a nationalist symbol largely occurred while the Habsburg Empire still existed. And that, my friends, is the root of all of this, right? So just so happened the same fine folks that were doing over in Vienna worried about our minds and stuff. And don't worry, I have more. This is just a tipping point here. So yeah. So right when this thinking was changing and all that stuff, the Habsburgs just still happened to be over there. Because during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Vienna was a major intellectual center. Nationalist movements were growing. Racial theories were becoming increasingly influential. Empires faced mounting social pressures. So the swastika began appearing in nationalist publications, clubs, organizations, and on flags and badges. By the time Adolf Hitler entered politics in 1919, the symbol was already circulating within certain nationalist circles. Gee, isn't that fascinating? Hitler entered a political environment in which the symbol already carried decades of accumulated nationalist meaning. So, in the 1920s, the Nazi Party adopted a red background, a white circle, a black swastika. Hitler later explained that he selected the design because it was visually powerful and capable of creating immediate recognition. His major contribution was not discovering the symbol. His contribution was transforming it into a mass political brand. So, in plain English, he did not start with an evil symbol. They started with an ancient symbol they believed supported their story of identity and ancestry. The ideology built around the symbol became progressively more extreme, and eventually the symbol became attached to some of the worst crimes of the 20th century. So, yes, yes, that was how it all worked. With dynastic empires such as the Romanovs and Habsburgs eventually collapsed, the Sassoons still operated through trade, finance, shipping, and commercial networks and proved to be more adaptable. The Sassoons' trajectory mirrored the movement of global power during the 19th century. And of course, the Sassoons occupied a very unique position. They originated within the Ottoman commerce world but transferred themselves into the expanding British imperial system before the Ottoman Empire fragmented. These Sassoon people, they are just geniuses at timing, just geniuses. During the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire experienced political instability, financial weakness, territorial losses, administrative problems. And meanwhile, Britain expanded maritime trade, industrial production, global finance, colonial administration. The Sassoons aligned themselves with a stronger system before the older one collapsed. Just such timing. These people are magnificent at their timing, aren't they? One of the most controversial aspects of the Sassoon story involves opium. The family became deeply involved in commerce connecting India and China. Through British imperial trade structures, opium became one of the most valuable commodities of the 19th century. The wealth the Sassoons generated through this system, and they owned about 70% of the opium trade. The Delanos and the other people had smaller portions. But the wealth they got just from the opium gave them real estate, shipping, banking, industry, philanthropy, and educational institutions. The family's fortune cannot be separated from the wider commercial systems of the British Empire. And here is the drum roll, okay? Here is the absolute drum roll. This is the time I've been circling for a long time. You know, that Civil War. The Civil War, you know, where you only have certain black and white photos because the cameras were not really geared up to be able to be traveling. They claim that, well, they had photography by the time of the Civil War, but, you know, They could get the cameras to the war, but they couldn't get they couldn't get the processing because of all the chemicals and stuff, too bulky to carry around. So that's why during the Civil War, all you'll see are like piles of bodies buried up, right? Well, they pulled that same trick during Nazi Germany, right? They would pile up bodies for the cameras, right? So during the Civil War, you see photos of a bunch of white bodies piled up, and they say, well, we didn't have any photos, so we couldn't take any more pictures. Well, I'm not so sure it was a war like they claim it is, right? They had all these different battles and stuff. I think it was just a matter of people weren't getting along over the shift in the idea of Satanism, and people revolted, seriously revolted. And I think they just literally went through, got rid of those people. They conveniently had those orphan trains running about that time, threw the kids they stole from the dead people they just killed to get their property and stuff. And they called it a civil war, right? Threw those kids on the train, and then they had all the property. So I don't think it was a really complicated process. But here's where the Sassoons enter the Civil War. The American Civil War was one of the biggest breaks the Sassoons ever caught. Oh boy. Yeah, so during the Civil War, like I said, it's suspicious that there's no photos. The only photos are like some stagnant photos, right? And yeah, and they called it a civil war, right? So yeah, I think these people were operating to take over for a long time, and that was the time that they jumped into action, right? And then they had the Gilded Age to further the thing because they did not build those houses. But anyway, so because when I read this part about the American Civil War was one of the biggest breaks the Sassoons ever caught, I swear to God, I could barely contain myself. Before the Civil War, Britain's textile industry depended heavily on cotton from the American South. Just like, we never won the war, so in this case, when the war began in 1861, really within that kind of time frame we're working with here, right? The Union blockade sharply reduced Confederate cotton exports. Very convenient, right? British mills suddenly faced a severe cotton shortage known as the Lancashire cotton famine. So Britain began looking elsewhere for cotton supplies. Well, David Sassoon was already perfectly positioned in Bombay. He already had trade networks, shipping connections, access to Indian cotton growers, relationships with British merchants, established export operations. The most convenient, these Sassoons, they really show up at convenient times. So when American cotton disappeared, Indian cotton became far more valuable. The Sassoons acted as a major middleman between Indian producers and British textile mills. The wealth generated from their boom helped finance later Sassoon's expansions into Bombay institutions, Shanghai operations, London society, philanthropy, schools, and libraries. And in kind of a twisted way, I've been saying this for years, we have really been paying for our own demise, right? So So when you see the Sassoons becoming much more powerful in the second half of the 19th century, the American Civil War is one of the major accelerators. It wasn't the only source of wealth. The opium trade was enormous, but the Civil War cotton boom handed them a major opportunity at exactly the right moment. The demand surge produced enormous profits. 1830 to 1850, Sassoons built cotton and opium networks from Bombay. Branches opened across Asia. They became major merchants before the Civil War. So then 1861 to 1865, the American Civil War, Southern cotton exports collapsed. Lancaster mills need replacement cotton. India becomes a major alternative supplier. Sassoon profits surge. After the war, many traders suffered when American cotton returned. So the Sassoons then used wartime profits to diversify into cotton mills, docks, real estates, banking, and industrial ventures. They emerged wealthier and more influential than before. A war in the United States created shortages in Britain. Those shortages increased demand in India. That demand enriched merchant families in Bombay like the Sassoons. The wealth generated from that boom helped finance later Sassoon expansion into Bombay institutions, Shanghai operations, London society, philanthropy, schools, and libraries. The Civil War cotton boom was not their only source of wealth, but it was a major accelerator. The Civil War cut off Southern cotton. Britain turned to India, and the Sassoons were already sitting in Bombay with the networks needed to profit from the crisis. I would say that was about the best timing on the planet. So let's kind of do a mini timeline here. These fires are just, I've been having fires on my mind. Now, remember, I'm working on a major timeline that will just blow your socks off. But for right now, I'm just going to do a quick snapshot, okay? Just to give you an idea about my suspicions and why this looks like a complete reset. And, well, a lot of things happened around this era. So, a lot of things seem to happen. So, 1776, the Great Fire of New York. Colonial era records are lost. 1835, the Great Fire of New York. Merchant and business records are lost. 1845, second major Manhattan fire. Additional commercial records are destroyed. 1854 to 1929, the orphan train movement. The orphan train movement relocates children across the United States, coming to an end in 1929. So during this whole key period here, we got those trains running, right? Well, they had to do something with those kids from the Civil War and stuff, right? And also those kids from the Crusaders and all that. So, yeah, right there, 1858, British Crown takes direct control of India. East India Company rule ends. The British Crown assumes direct administration of India. Much of the East India Company's trade infrastructure remains in place. And then that was 1858. And then look, 1861 to 1865, the American Civil War. Drum roll, please. Da, da, da. The Civil War disrupts commerce, transportation, and record keeping. Before the war, Britain's textile industry depended heavily on cotton from the American South. The Union blockade sharply reduces Confederate cotton exports. British mills begin searching for alternative cotton supplies. India becomes a major replacement source, and the Sassoons were already there in Bombay. And then 1863 to 1878, they need to bring in white children because remember, the people who took over weren't necessarily white, okay? That was the Crusacian migration, 1863 to 1878. Conveniently, right at the time those trains were rolling, right? Large numbers of Crusacians are displaced following conflicts involving the Russian Empire. Yes, the Russians and the Romanovs and the Ottoman Empire. Many of those people settled in Ottoman territories, but many of those people ended up on trains here in the United States. So I'll be getting back to that later. But anyway, so moving right along, October 1871, the Great Chicago Fire. The Great Chicago Fire destroys much of Chicago. 17,000 buildings are destroyed. More than 100,000 people are left homeless. Many local records, business documents, church records, and municipal records are lost. The fire becomes one of the largest record destruction events in American urban history. And of course, we have the parallel timelines, right? We can't forget the German and Austria national writers increasingly transform the swastika into a symbol of ancestral, racial, and identity. And at the same time, the Sassoons were over there building up schools and stuff. See what my suspicions were? Because right in that same time period, the Sassoons were over there building educational institutions, political institutions, commercial institutions, and financial institutions. So, yeah, I didn't find the smoking gun there, but I found the smoking gun in the timeline, right? So, yeah, so parallel timelines indeed. And then, of course, 1877 to 1897, the Gilded Age, rapid industrialization, wealth concentration, railroad expansion, and corporate growth characterize the era. Large fortunes emerge. Immigration increases significantly. Urban growth accelerates. 1880s, Chicago rebuilds. Chicago rapidly rebuilds and becomes a major destination for immigrations arriving from Eastern Europe, Germany, Russia, Poland, Lithuania, Austria-Hungary. Many families arriving after this period have difficulty tracing earlier records because of losses from the fire. And then 1890, they run into that little problem with the census, right? The 1890 census records an American population of approximately 63 million. For geologists and historians, it becomes one of the most important census collections ever created, lost, completed. So, right when the 1890 census is completed, well, that falls in the same time period as the transformation of the swastika. The transformation of the swastika, I pinned it down to 1890 to 1915. And during that period, the swastika increasingly moves from archaeological and ancient symbolism into nationalist politics. So, and the symbol begins appearing in publications, clubs, organizations, flags, and badges right at the same time those Habsburgs were over there in Vienna, right? And of course, killing their own. April 15, 1912, the Titanic, right? Same time frame, right? Bye bye, bye bye, bye bye. They murdered all the rest of those people to kill three of their own. So yes, I would say they often like to kill their own. So, and of course, they had another big fire in New York, March 1911, New York State Library fire, one of the most archival disasters in American history. Massive losses include books, manuscripts, maps, government records, genealogy materials, and historical collections. And I didn't reel back further, but remember, the first thing that got tossed out was, let me put this on hold for a second. Well, I can't remember. I'll keep moving. But anyway, so it all comes out in the timeline, and I have more than you ever want to read down below and on my website. And right around the same time frame, what happens in 1913? The Federal Reserve Act. And following that, they went over and had the Armenian Genocide, 1915 to 17, and that brought forward more children to feed into those trains and stuff to whiten up the population here. And right after that, 1916, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. That's when the UK and France secretly agreed to break up the Middle East, right? Give them all those new flags, and those flags just happen to have satanic images. So, yeah, that crest and those stars. So those flags in the Middle East after the collapse of the Ottoman all are satanic appearing. So, yeah, I would say there was a pretty big reset around this time because that was 1916, and these census fires started right after that because I had followed those the census fire on Ellis Island. What happened was this: the records that weren't destroyed on Ellis Island got moved to some building in Washington. Then after they were moved to Washington, they had an unfortunate accident, and so they claim that there was some fear of a fire or something, and so they were in some basement stored somewhere, and so somebody had to turn on the sprinklers, and so when they turned on the sprinklers, whoops, the records got all wet. So yeah, that happened in January the 10th of 1921. That was when a fire breaks out in the Commerce Building in Washington, D.C., and large portions of the 1890 census are damaged. Yeah, many surviving records suffer smoke and water damage, so really there was not much left, right? So those records were destroyed in 1921 to 1934. Destruction of the 1890 census. The loss creates one of the largest gaps in American genealogy. Gee, you see why I'm kind of suspicious about all these time frames? So, just as a little snapshot here, 1776, Great Fire of New York. There was another Great Fire of New York in 1835. Then 1845, there was a second major Manhattan fire. 1871, we had the Great Chicago Fire. 1890, the census got all destroyed and they were later damaged in that 1921 building fire. And in 1911, there was a New York State Library fire. Oh, I forgot. In between there, they went in and burned up Washington. Yes, Washington was burned in 1814 time frame. Okay, let me rework this. So New York, 1776, one fire. 1835, next fire. 1845, next fire. And then the 1871 Chicago Great Fire. And then 1911, the New York State Library fire. And then 1921 is when they finally got rid of all the rest of those census records. So uh, the result is that many immigrant family, business, church, and community histories became significantly more difficult to reconstruct between approximately 1870 and 1900. So yeah, right, the same time frames, right? You can't really, when you look at a timeline, it becomes harder for things to become squishy, right? So yeah, and right during the same time period, 1890 to 1915, the swastika moves from archaeological to nationalist politics. So yeah, it was Guido von Lees and others begin attaching the symbol to ancestry and racial narratives. And then they come along, they have all those fires. The Titanic sinks in 1913. They set up the Federal Reserve. 1914, World War I. 1915, Armenian genocide. 1916, Sykes-Picot. 1917, the Romanovs and the Habsburg. The Romanovs collapse in 1917. 1918, the Habsburgs collapse. Germany monarchy collapses. In 1921 to 34, destruction of most of the 1890 census. So yeah, I would say that this time frame really would not have caught my attention had I not been a big advocate of timelines, right? So yeah, because that swastika didn't become a symbol overnight, right? So that transformation really, well, that's what it is, right? Took me a long way. I had like just of the pages of stuff that I went through in the Sassoons alone was just hundreds of pages. I was looking at all of their universities. I was looking at all the different libraries they funded. I was looking at who sat on those boards and all that. And in the end, the answer was in my own timeline. And all the money, all the power, and children will still go to bed hungry tonight. The fires, the reset. Who are these people really? The American experiment is a deception like no other. A circus and a slideshow comes to mind. Life isn't about waiting for the storm to pass. It's learning to dance and let me start over again. The American experiment, because I'm having some trouble speaking, is what the issue is. I don't want to address it in every segment, but I'm having some trouble speaking, but I'm still functionally able to relay information. So if I get to the point that I'm having trouble keeping my facts straight, I will certainly let you know. But it crossed my brain barrier a while ago, this sulfur stuff, and this stuff is wicked. It's just. But here's the thing. This is just a game board. We all knew what was going to be ahead. We all agreed before we came here. Otherwise, you'd have to be thinking that our creator would just throw us down here without any ideas or any kind of consent. No, we all knew ahead of time. We all just forgot. That's why I keep encouraging you. You need to know, why are you here? This is the biggest event, the big circus act of all time. The big curtain will come down between good and evil. You can hear that circus music dancing in the background as I talk. Do, 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 do. Yeah, the circus is going to get unreal soon here, because this is a big battleground between good and evil. Who wants to leave the game board early? This is an event that we've all been waiting for a very long time for. It's time to buckle up, sit up straight. Remember, this is only a game board. And this American experiment is a deception like no other. It is a circus and a sideshow. And that's what comes to mind for me. And remember this, life isn't about waiting for the storm to pass, it's learning to dance in the rain. Be safe out there. Goodbye for now.